Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 20294 in the name of Craig Hoy on lowering bills for Scotland's workers. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Craig Hoy to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I wish you a happy new year, and can I move the motion in my name? 2026 must be the year in which Scotland's politicians tackle the cost of living crisis, because people across Scotland are under pressure. Many families are struggling to get by, their bills are rising and everyday costs keep going up. But after years of SNP tax rises and wasteful spending, voters will, in a matter of weeks, face a clear choice. The SNP and Labour want people to keep paying more tax through higher tax and increasing the benefits bill. And Reform joins them in also wanting to increase Scotland's soaring social security bill. All of this adds to the pressure on hard-working Scottish families. But there is a different way, a common-sense way that focuses on bringing down bills and making work pay. An approach that focuses on widening the tax base, not hitting the same people harder and harder each and every year. And that is what our motion sets out to do today. At its core is the same call that we made at last year's budget, to cut income tax on lower and middle income workers, to do so by scrapping the Scottish basic and intermediate rates of income tax, and by replacing them by a single Scottish income tax rate, a flat 19% rate on earnings up to the higher rate threshold of £44,000. But we need to go much further than this to deal with the damaging effects of fiscal drag. In her first budget, Rachel Reeves said freezing tax thresholds would hurt working people. But barely 12 months later, she froze them for 3 years, following in the footsteps of the SNP. Now, today we propose to reverse this, to lift thresholds in line with inflation, to use a new zero rate to increase the point where Scots start paying income tax altogether, not just this year, but each in the next 5 years of the following Parliament. And this is why we have to do so, because if thresholds remain at present levels, by the end of the decade, most Scottish workers will be paying the higher rate of tax, a tax meant for high earners, paid by those on average incomes. Under Labour and the SNP, higher rate tax for the many, not the few. That is the reality of the SNP's fiscal policy, which is, of course, aided and abetted by Scottish Labour. Deputy Presiding Officer, these are the pernicious effects of prolonged fiscal drag, raising taxes on hundreds of thousands of Scots through the back door. But worse still, these stealth tax raids involve taking money from pay packets to fund billions in extra welfare spending, a benefits bill which is set to reach £10 billion by the end of the decade. Now, when I met with Mr McKee and the Finance Secretary, Shona Robertson quite rightly asked how we were going to pay for it. And let me tell the Minister how we're going to do it. We will cut waste in government, going further than the £1 billion identified allegedly by Mr McKee. We will cut the benefits bill while ensuring that those in genuine need continue to secure proper support. We will set out specifically in time which benefits we will scale back once we hear from the Scottish Government in next week's budget. Once we discover just how much more she is set to snatch from working households to blow on Benefits Street. But let me be clear to workers and businesses. In recent years, the SNP has made the decision to increase taxes to pay for ever more benefits. They have the cheek to say that these tax increases fall on those with the broadest shoulders, when we all know that teachers and nurses are paying more. And as my colleague Russell Finlay said this week, the government isn't asking workers to pay, they're demanding they do so. They have no choice in the matter. They can't just turn round and say, sorry Shona, I'll skip paying your higher taxes this year. It's a non-negotiable, a one-way street to ever more tax to pay for ever more welfare. But it doesn't, Deputy Presiding Officer, have to be this way, because reducing benefits incentivises work. It puts more money into people's pockets, it generates more in tax receipts, and in turn it delivers more economic growth. Now, before I close, let me return to the frankly laughable SNP motion put before MSPs today. It says the government must respect Parliament by outlining its tax policy only when it publishes its budget next week. So let's reflect on that SNP culture of respect for this Parliament. What respect did it show when core details of last year's budget somehow found their way into the mainstream media before Shona Robertson even got to her feet? What respect did it show to this Parliament when in 2022 Nicola Sturgeon's vitally important COVID update was reported by the press long before being announced to this Parliament, something the presiding officer said was disappointing and disrespectful? And just this week, what respect did this government show to this Parliament when media reports suggested that the Justice Secretary was safe in her role even before the findings of an official probe was published? Absolutely no respect whatsoever. So let's take no lectures from a party that repeatedly treats this Parliament and the Scottish people with utter contempt. Deputy Presiding Officer. The measures in our motion today will go a considerable way to closing the corrosive tax differential with the rest of the UK. They will save average full-time workers over £600 this year and by raising thresholds by £1,300 by 2030-31. This will grow the tax base and deliver growth. They prove that the Scottish Conservatives are the only party serious about cutting tax and cutting waste, the only party serious about cutting the SNP's bloated benefits bill, and the only party committed to a fairer deal for Scottish workers.
Thank you, Mr Hoy. I now call the Minister Ivan McKee to speak to and move Amendment 20294.2. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. Presiding Officer, let me begin with a point of consensus. We all want to ease the pressure on household budgets. Across Scotland, people are still feeling the strain of the cost of living crisis. Prices remain high, energy bills are still elevated and household budgets are stretched. Inflation may be easing, but the impact of years of rising prices remains. The Scottish Government understands that reality, and our priority is to support people with fairness and with responsibility. Today I want to focus on three things: the Conservative proposal and its implications, our current income tax policy and the principles behind it, and the practical action the Scottish Government is taking to support households across the country. Turning first to the Conservative income tax plans. Russell Finlay wrote to the First Minister on this recently. Our estimates show that their income tax asks would cost the Scottish budget over £1 billion in 2026-27. That is the difference between maintaining essential public services and making deep cuts to the everyday support people rely on. We are always willing to work constructively across the Chamber, but that requires proposals that are credible, proposals that add up and are honest about what they mean for services and for the households who depend on them.
Craig Hoy.
Thank you. Will the Minister commit to, if we come forward with fully costed proposals to meet the cost of our tax cuts, will he come forward with fully costed proposals to find the £10 billion that this Government intends to pay on welfare by the end of the decade? Minister.
Well, I think if the member went and read the work that we've already published in terms of the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan and the medium-term financial strategy, the answers to that are clear. And this Government, unlike the UK Government, Conservative or Labour, manages to balance its budget every single year. So, by contrast, our income tax policies balances the need to raise revenue with investment in health, education and social care, and households in the lower half of the income distribution are on average around £450 a year better off under Scotland's tax and social security system. If I've got time... There's no extra time, but if the member wishes to make some progress. Our approach is fair. We ask those with the broadest shoulders to contribute a little more so that families and public services are protected. In return, people benefit from support not available throughout the rest of the UK, including the Scottish Child Payment, free prescriptions and free access to higher education. And despite the naysayers, Scotland continues to attract positive inward migration from the rest of the UK, while seeing strong levels of inward investment from abroad. The Conservatives claim their plans can be funded by reducing social security and making efficiency savings. But these claims are vague, and people can rightly expect clarity. What cuts are they proposing to social security? Is it support for children, for disabled people, for pensioners? The Scottish Government has already identified around £1 billion in realistic efficiency over 5 years in the medium-term financial strategy, while protecting frontline services very importantly. Any efficiencies that the Conservatives are talking about would be, of course, in addition to that. The people of Scotland won't see that as credible without cuts to public services in our hospitals, schools and social care. That is the difference between a workable, well-thought-out plan and, frankly, what is little more than a slogan. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is already delivering practical support that matters to households. We provide universal free school meals for more than 230,000 children in primaries 1 to 5 and in special schools, as well as eligible pupils beyond that. For families, that is a saving of around £450 per child each year. Free tuition. Well, students in England face tuition fees of up to £28,600. They are, of course, free in Scotland. Free prescriptions, now £9.90 per item south of the border. Free bus travel for over 2 million people in Scotland. We have removed ScotRail peak fares for good, and in doing so we're helping people with ongoing cost of living pressures while tackling the climate emergency by saving existing rail passengers money and encouraging new passengers onto the trains and to leave their car at home. Our council tax reduction scheme cut bills for over 450,000 people, helping households retain more of their income while every penny counts. And the Scottish Child Payment, one of the most important anti-poverty measures anywhere in the UK, now supports over 320,000 families with children under 16 and could lift 40,000 children out of relative poverty in this financial year. These are not vague ideas on a page. They are real measures already making a difference and all funded by a responsible tax policy that protects public services while easing pressure on families. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government approach is responsible, progressive and deliverable. It protects services, supports families and is based on what Scotland can realistically afford. The Conservative alternative is none of that. It is expensive, vague and unfunded, leaving a £1 billion gap with no explanation of which services they would cut. In a time when households need certainty, Scotland cannot afford unfunded promises. What this Government offers is a credible, fair and affordable plan for Scotland's future. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Michael Mara to speak to and move Amendment 20294.1. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A happy New Year to you, and I move the amendment in my name. And people are indeed feeling the burden of higher prices and wages that in 14 years the Tories barely increased at all. Living standards were lower at the end of the last UK Parliament than at the beginning. It's the first time that has happened since the Napoleonic Wars. That's the record of the party opposite. And the cost of living crisis is far from over. Alongside the state of Scotland's NHS, it's the top issue for people I speak to in Dundee each week. So I welcome the progress the UK Labour Government has begun to make in tackling the cost of living. 6 interest rate cuts, not yet, I'm just beginning, Ms Smith, I appreciate it. 6 interest rate cuts, bringing the average cost of a mortgage down by £1,500, the average wage up by £1,800 as the minimum wage is bolstered. The most recent UK budget taking £158 off of energy bills, with the warm home discounts delivering £300 off bills for the most at-need households. Inflation falling, wages rising. These are very welcome steps which will ease the pressure on hard-pressed households across the country, but we know that there is still much more to do, and not least and the subject of today's debate, the pressure which the SNP's tax regime is putting on ordinary Scots. The majority of Scots are paying more tax than elsewhere in the UK. And I believe the Minister, and perhaps some form of wording, just tried to make the counter-claim to that, along with Shona Robson and John Swinney. The spurious claim to the contrary are demonstrably false. As Professor Mary Spouge of the Fraser Allender Institute has pointed out just in recent days of the SNP minister's claims, in the last 2 financial years they turned out not to be true. And that's a quote. Let's be clear, those in Scotland paying more and more tax each year are not those with the broadest shoulders, as the SNP tried to claim and as the Minister has just claimed again today in Parliament. The bulk of additional tax revenue does not come from the ultra-rich. Rather, it comes from those earning just over £40,000. They are nurses, teachers and police officers working hard in our overstretched public services. They are shop managers, IT workers and salespeople working hard in hard-pressed businesses. Please.
Ms Smith.
I entirely agree with what Mr Michael Mara has just said, but can I ask, where does Labour stand when it comes to this huge burden of the national insurance tax on employers? Surely that's increasing the cost of living.
Michael Mara.
Well, in terms of the amount of money that's been invested in public services, what the Labour government across the UK inherited was not just an economy that had flatlined for 14 years. It was public services in acute crisis and a significant black hole in the public finances. In order to address those, money had to be raised, and the money has to come from somewhere. I know that the SNP continually claim from these government benches that we can have an infinite amount of money and it doesn't matter where it comes from. An additional £130 billion of borrowing they have claimed for across the the UK, if you're going to invest in public services, it has to come from somewhere. We have to make sure that we raise taxes and we take tough decisions about how that can happen. But the personal tax bills that people are paying are considerable, and people, as I'm saying, are hard-pressed, and there are people in middle incomes who are struggling to make ends meet. So it always makes it more likely, no thank you sir, it always makes it more likely that the public can accept paying a bit more in tax if they can see improvements in public services. So one has to come with the other. But in Scotland, our NHS is in chaos, with waits over 12 hours in A&E continuing to rise. Our education system is in crisis, with falling attainment and staff on the verge of burnout. And we have an SNP housing emergency with over 10,000 children stuck in temporary accommodation and house building rates among the worst in our history. Scots are paying more and getting less in return.
Thank you, Mr Mara. And I call on Patrick Harvey to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
I always welcome the chance to debate the tax system and how to make it fairer, and I'm proud of the Green record in achieving this. Our 2016 manifesto proposals became the basis of the 5-band income tax system that Scotland adopted. We set the tipping point at which people should start paying a little more tax at roughly the average full-time salary, largely because we thought people would see that as fair. Well, the system has been tweaked a little bit since then, and the 6-band system now in place continues the same direction of travel, even if we think it could go further. And although the SNP have relied too much for my liking on the idea that most people pay a bit less tax, I think this is an argument that implies accepting the right-wing framing of tax being a bad thing. Although they lean too heavily on that argument, they have continued to ensure that Scotland's income tax system takes a progressive direction. Those who can afford to pay more do so, because the alternative is cuts to services which fall heaviest on those who have the least. In the 25-26 budget, Scotland's tax changes generated around £1.7 billion extra for public services, so Scottish tax policy unquestionably protects the services that are needed by those who don't enjoy high incomes, and it makes possible groundbreaking initiatives like the Scottish Child Payment. Let's compare all of that with the Tory plan. £1.1 billion in tax cuts. That's the equivalent to the entire Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands portfolio going in a oneer. Don't want to scrap that? They say they prefer cuts to social security. Maybe do away with that Scottish Child Payment then. An internationally recognised initiative, the single most successful measure for cutting child poverty. No, sorry, even that wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't even meet half the cost of this Tory black hole. How about the affordable housing supply programme then? That would get us closer. Scrapping that would save £768 million. So only a third of $1 billion of other cuts still to find. And I'm sure the Tories think that leaving people at the mercy of unregulated private landlords would be a reasonable alternative to affordable housing. But it's not just, presiding officer, it's not just the cuts that this plan would rely on that nauseate me. It's also about who gets the benefit. From the changes that are set out in the motion alone, for a young full-time worker on the minimum wage, this plan would benefit them by something like £40 a year. Someone closer to an average income, £25,000, they might save something like £100 a year. Now, I'm sure that little bit of extra cash would be welcome to people on those incomes. And if they were very lucky, their landlord wouldn't just hike the rent and take it straight back off them again. But let's then look at someone on twice that income. £50,000. From my calculation, they'd be saving something like £440 a year. Craig Hoy suggests that figure could be up to more than £600 a year, and that same £600 a year saving would go to people on 60 grand, 80 grand, 100 grand a year under this plan. For someone on those high incomes, 400 quid, 600 quid a year is nothing. They wouldn't even notice the difference. Presiding officer, a case can be made for cutting income tax further for low earners and for people on middle earners, but it can only be made if we ensure that the high earners and the wealth owners are the ones paying for it. But this Tory plan of giving high earners the biggest tax cuts and paying for it all by slashing the public services most relied upon by the least wealthy, this is no surprise from the Conservatives. It is their natural instinct. but it would be bad for our society, bad for our economy, and it would be a fundamentally uncivilised policy.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. And I now call on Jamie Green to open on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you. I do actually agree with the notion that I think our current politics has been defined by the cost of living, and people's perception of whether their government or governments are on their side or not, as the case may be. And that does include the question of tax policy, actually. I mean, this Parliament has had tax varying powers since its very inception, but it's only a lever that the Scottish Government has actually used to various degrees since 2017. I say various degrees of both success and popularity. And it's, of course, the focus of the next few weeks, particularly approaching budget, will centre around that conversation around tax bans and rates and who are the perceived doves and hawks around taxation. But I think we're completely missing the other elephant in the room, which we actually very rarely debate, and that's the question of whether tax differentials north of the border actually generate the levels of additional revenue that the public are led to believe that it does. The answer to that question is it does not, because we're not seeing proportionate net benefit of paying more tax. In the financial year, as other members have mentioned, the Scottish Government expects to generate an additional £1.7 billion in Scottish income tax due to policy decisions that it's made, and that's fine, that's their decision. But the Scottish budget will only benefit to the tune of £616 million. Those are independently verified figures. Put it simply, for every pound in extra tax paid by a Scottish taxpayer, only 36 pence of it will actually be available to the Scottish Government to spend on public services. The Auditor-General has been crystal clear about this, on this disparity, and he states why that is the case. I see the Minister looking at me strangely. I can hand him the Audit Scotland report that states this fact. We know that how much is actually generated in revenue does not all come back to the Scottish purse. It doesn't. We have an underperforming tax base, we have sluggish wage growth and productivity in Scotland, and sluggish overall economic growth as compared to other parts of the UK. That is what is creating the funding gap. I know the fiscal settlement is complex. It's complex. Probably only a handful of people truly understand how it works. But the government too often cites the tax intake figure as gospel and to vindicate its tax policies. They were also criticised by Audit Scotland for its complete lack of transparency over this whole issue. If you ask people in the real world if they are comfortable paying that wee bit more in tax to fund our precious NHS or to make sure our teachers are paid well, as others have argued, then some very well may say yes, absolutely. But I'm not so convinced that they would sign up to an alternative tax regime if they knew how little of it actually benefited the Scottish budget. Of course we need to raise the size of the overall tax base. Of course we need, if I had less than a minute I would. Of course we need to raise earnings across the board, because raised earnings will inevitably lead to higher tax intakes. But here's a sobering statistic. In the year 23-24, 20% of all Scottish taxpayers paid 66% of all tax. In fact, the top 1% of all taxpayers paid 20% of all tax. And that is a sobering reminder that we do need to grow the number of high earners. It should not be controversial. It is a necessity, in fact. Now, the government will argue about our low unemployment rate sitting at 3.8%, and that's great. But it ignores not just the fact of how many people are in or out of work, but what their earnings are, how well off they actually feel, and put bluntly, what their tax-paying potential is to the government coffers. And I am, finally, in the last few seconds, really nervous about how many well-educated professional young Scots we will see in the brain drain over the coming years, because they are being attracted by glossy ads for the Gold Coast in Canada and Spain's flat-rate tax for digital nomads. Our challenge will be to encourage them to remain in Scotland, and if they're not already here, consider coming here and making a life here. Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Green. We now move to the open debate. Speeches of up to 4 minutes. I call Alexander Stewart to be followed by Jamie Hepburn. Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to speak in favour of the motion which calls for lower bills for Scottish workers, also something a cost of living crisis and an end to the SNP's high tax agenda. The devolution of extensive taxation powers to the Scottish Government was an opportunity to create a tax system which supports Scottish businesses, incentivises growth and delivers for the Scottish public. However, it seems that the current SNP government only ever saw these powers as a chance to hike taxes for hard-pressed Scottish workers. Making Scotland the highest tax part of the United Kingdom is hardly a legacy that the Scottish Government would have hoped for, but it's exactly what they have created, Presiding Officer. Stakeholders such as the Scottish Financial Enterprise and the CBI continue to highlight the impact of these taxes on Scottish businesses. The CBI has said that higher Scottish taxes mean that businesses are struggling to compete for highly skilled staff, and the current income tax policy is acting like a handbrake on the economic growth of Scotland. The Institute of Fiscal Studies also called Scotland's income tax system unnecessarily complicated, and that was before the SNP introduced the sixth band to the tax system. Their analysis also shows behavioural changes caused by the tax policy mean that it's unclear as to how much revenue these changes have raised, and that the government should be open to reversing the course on their tax policy. Regardless of what the Scottish Government may say, it's unlikely that they'll be changing direction anytime soon, Presiding Officer. Not content with keeping the higher rate threshold significantly lower than elsewhere in the UK, the SNP raised the higher rate to 41% and then raised it again in 2023. The SNP's income tax strategy has never been anything else than tax rising and the burden that has been keeping on year. Therefore, Scotland is left with a tax system that is too complicated, too damaging to growth and too costly to the taxpayer. The SNP have played this game for many years, and it would be naive to believe that they're going to stop anytime soon. Presiding Officer, our solutions are quite clear. We are calling for the SNP to up the income tax thresholds in line with inflation, both in the forthcoming 26-27 budget and for future budgets. We also want to see simpler Scottish income tax system for the single rate of 19% applied up for the higher rates. These are proportionate and reasonable policies which would bring us close to the current tax gap and the rest of the United Kingdom. And it would ensure that tax cuts for the vast majority of Scots could be up to £600. That is exactly what we should be trying to do, put more money back into the pockets of hard-pressed Scots and workers in our country to support us. They are also here to help undo the damage of the SNP's high tax agenda already done to the Scottish economy. It would also make Scotland an attractive destination for top talent, and that's exactly what we should be trying to do. Attract talent, not send it elsewhere, which we are doing on a daily basis. I would also like to indicate that Scotland's...
the members in his
I'm in my last minute. I want to see Scotland's tax system support growth, reward work and deliver lower bills for Scottish workers. This would be achieved by cutting government waste, we've already heard, by cutting into the unsustainable benefit bill that every party in this chamber wants to increase, and by supporting hard-pressed taxpayers and householders. I therefore support the motion in the name of Craig Hoy, because these are sensible, looking forward, pragmatic issues that we need to do to support our communities, our constituents and our businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. I call Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Becan Gallagher. Mr Hepburn.
Thank you very much, President Officer. I'm very happy to contribute to today's debate. Last time I took part in a Tory debate, Mr Hoy happened to be closing that debate. He said my contribution was one of the worst speeches he had heard in his time in Parliament. I look forward to disappointing him again, because frankly, if that's his assessment, then I think I'm along the right tracks, Presiding Officer. It's interesting, we heard again today the Tory refrain, common sense, as if what they lay out as a common sense approach. One of the things we didn't hear, I thought we might hear that we often hear from the Tories, is that somehow the approach that's been taken by the Scottish Government is an ideological approach, as if ideology was in of itself somehow a four-letter word. But what we see from the Conservatives in terms of their approach, in terms of their tax-cutting approach, in terms of their disinvestment in public services, frankly, is also an ideological approach. So we shouldn't pretend it is anything other than such. And the greatest manifestation of that, of course, and it's clear where they get their inspiration from, because we know that the Tory leader in this place was a great supporter of the Truss Quartine budget that we saw in 2022, utterly underpinned by Tory. He's laughing. I don't know why he's laughing. Maybe he's forgotten. I'm happy to remind him that he supported that budget, utterly underpinned by Tory ideology. It was predicated on a system of the cost of living. That budget saw inflation increase from 2% to 10% and saw mortgage rates triple overnight. So much for assisting with the cost of living. And it's interesting that, and I think to be fair, the Tories do accept this, that their approach to taxation would reduce the amount of revenue that's actually accrued to the public purse. If they don't accept it, then they should, because that's what would happen. We saw with similar proposals back in 2022 to those that they advanced just now, the Fraser-Vallender Institute said that would generate or see a potential revenue loss of approximately £420 million to the public purse here in Scotland. But despite that, we'll still hear for calls for an increase in expenditure in many areas from the Conservative Party. Just this week we've seen, in fact, Mr Harvey made this point just yesterday in the Petitions Committee debate on investment in swimming pools and swimming infrastructure. We heard calls for more investment in that area. We saw just this week for a call from the Tories for increased investment in legal aid. We've seen them say that there should be more money put into the Scottish Veterans Fund. We've heard of them talking about creating a new affordable transition fund. All of themselves perfectly legitimate proposals to advance, but they cannot be taken that seriously, that credibly, if at the same time they're looking to cut tax. And turning to the point that was made by Alexander Stewart, that we have the highest taxes in the UK. Well, of course, this is where I slightly disagree with Mr Harvey. I think there's nothing wrong with us making the point that actually most payers of income tax in Scotland pay less in income tax than they do in the rest of the UK. But it's also a very narrow analysis of tax liability, because we also know that the average Bandy council tax bill in Scotland this year is £1,543. The average Bandy council tax set by local authorities in England for this year is £2,280. So much for Scotland being the highest tax part of the UK. We should have a focus on assisting people with the cost of living crisis. I'm proud and pleased that we have a Scottish Government that's doing just that, with its investment in abolishing peak rail fares, with its continued commitment to free prescriptions, free eye appointments, with its commitment to funding childcare hours, which would otherwise cost more than £6,000 a year per eligible child. That's a record that I'm proud of. It's a record I stand behind.
Thank you, Mr Hepburn. Point of order, Douglas Ross.
I'm grateful, Presiding Officer. Jamie Hepburn has just said, and I quote, "More than half of taxpayers in Scotland pay less income tax than elsewhere in the United Kingdom." Mary Spowage of the Fraser-Vallender Institute has said that claim has been false for the last 2 financial years. Therefore, can Mr Hepburn use this opportunity to apologise for misleading the Chamber and correct the official record? And maybe if he does it, the front bench, up to and including the First Minister, will stop using that spurious claim.
Thank you, Mr Ross. Mr Ross will be aware that is not a point of order. It's up to members to determine in what way they seek to contribute. Excuse me, members, Mr Finlay, I am speaking. I am addressing the apparent point of order made by Mr Finlay's colleague, and I would expect, in terms of some respect to be shown to the Chair, that Mr Finlay might manage to listen to my response to his colleague without interrupting. As I was saying, it is up to members to determine how they deal with their contributions in debate. Of course, I would finally say that in terms of corrective procedures, all members are aware of how to do that. And so I would now call Megan Gallagher to be followed by Gordon MacDonald. Ms Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This Parliament is designed to stand up for working people in Scotland. But since the SNP took office, working people have been told, not asked, but told, to pay more, work harder and accept less in return. That's not fairness. That is failure. And our motion today is simple. We are calling on the Scottish Government to reduce income tax on working people, to uprate income tax thresholds in line with inflation in the forthcoming Scottish budget and in future budgets, to simplify a system that has become punitive, confusing and deeply unfair. But we also believe that the Scottish basic rate and intermediate rate of income tax should be replaced with a single Scottish income tax rate of 19p on income up to the higher rate threshold. I don't think these are radical demands, but they are measures designed to put more money back into the pockets of everyday, ordinary working Scots, and also to reduce the growing tax gap with the rest of the United Kingdom and to begin repairing the damage done by years of SNP income tax policy. Middle earners, that's nurses who care for us, police officers who keep our communities safe, the teachers shaping our children's futures, they are all paying more in tax than anywhere else in the rest of the UK. But what do they receive in return? Well, that's fewer services, longer waiting times, a crumbling infrastructure and a childcare system that still has a huge financial barrier for many families. Absolutely. And of course, we've heard from Jamie Hepburn and the Minister and others today about all of the free policies that are offered in Scotland. But of course, what they didn't mention is that those free policies are actually paid for by taxpayers right up and down the country. But that is the SNP's record. It's higher taxes, it's lower value and it's broken promises. I will take an intervention.
Briefly, Minister.
Tax pays for those free things, and people wouldn't get those free things if we did what the Conservative Party wants us to do and reduce tax rates.
Megan Gallagher.
Well, it's not free then, as the Minister. But that is the SNP and indeed other political parties' approach to taxation in this country. Their policy is, if it moves, we are going to tax it. Yeah. But they must know that it punishes ambition. They must know that it penalises progression and it hits the hardest those who are trying to move up the career ladder, take on an extra responsibility or secure a better future for their family. And while the SNP tells all of us to wait for the budget for clarity, as it has been the case and been conveyed by other colleagues, nothing stops the SNP from putting those messages out before the budget. And I think what would be really welcomed, actually, is a different approach to what the current taxation system currently is. But I do want to touch upon working parents, if I may, because for working parents, the situation is even more stark. Too many families are forced to make impossible choices when it comes to childcare in this country, reducing hours, turning down promotions or leaving the workforce altogether. And that's because they have to choose between what they can do because they don't have that additional money in their pocket to be able to make those decisions free of will. And for many younger people in this country, that dream of becoming a homeowner or a parent is made more difficult because of the choices that are made in this chamber. Presiding officer, I know I'm in the last couple of minutes. I do want to say, just in my last couple of seconds, it is time for a different approach, one that backs working people, one that recognises the real pressures that they face, and one that puts fairness, growth and opportunity back at the heart of Scotland's tax system. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Gallagher. I now call Gordon MacDonald to be followed by Daniel Johnson. Mr MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Nobody likes paying income tax or any tax, but I believe that those with the broadest shoulders, including MSPs, should pay a bit more, enabling Scotland to spend more on the things that matter most to people. Better schools, lower crime rates, affordable housing, falling NHS waiting lists, lifting children out of poverty and lower unemployment. What we pay in income tax is important primarily because it is the Scottish Government's main source of revenue after the block grant for funding public services like health, local government and education. This proposal, no, I've got 4 minutes, this proposal by the Tory party would remove up to £1 billion from the Scottish budget. Currently, those Scottish employees on the national living wage already pay lower income tax than elsewhere in the UK, as does those earning the real living wage. Those individuals today who earn the median gross pay in Scotland, which is higher than the UK median pay, are asked for an additional £94 per year or £8 per month. Or those on the top of the intermediate rate would pays an extra £11 per month based on the HMRC tax calculator. So what do Scots receive in return? Public transport users who are under 22 and over 60 are receiving free bus travel, which in Edinburgh is a saving of £68 per month. If you commute by train, then the removal of peak fares has reduced the cost substantially by up to 48%, which is not available elsewhere on these isles. Council tax for Band D properties in Scotland pay around £700 per annum less than similar Band D properties south of the border, saving £61 per month. Water bills which are lower than England and Wales, and the SNP record on affordable house building means Scotland's average rate of affordable housing delivery per head has been around 47% higher than England and 73% higher than Wales. Then there are the interventions to tackle poverty, starting with the baby box that 360,000 families have enjoyed since the scheme started, and providing the support they needed to give their children the best start in life. The Scottish Child Payment, which supports over 320,000 children under 16 across Scotland, and is the only part of the UK where child poverty is falling. There are no student fees, which support many of our most marginalised communities to get out of poverty through further and higher education. The cost of living increase has been made worse with food inflation, which has increased since Brexit and continues to rise faster than inflation caused by the policies of Johnson and Truss. Then there is the Labour's job tax on employers introduced, which impacted employers' ability to give meaningful pay rises. As I indicated earlier, this Tory motion is likely to cut the Scottish budget by up to £1 billion at a time when Tory MSPs are always asking to spend more money on whatever happens to be their pet project of the month. If the Tory party had wanted to alleviate the tax burden on Scottish workers, they could. When they were in government at Westminster, unfrozen the personal allowance, but they didn't, and Jeremy Hunt extended that freeze up to April 2028. This is nothing more than a Tory election gimmick that cannot be fulfilled without massive cuts to our current levels of services to our communities.
Thank you, Mr MacDonald. And I call Daniel Johnson. Mr Johnson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me join the Minister in starting with a point of consensus. I appreciate the fact that we have the opportunity to debate the economy and tax. These opportunities, unfortunately, come all too infrequently in this place. I think to the extent that the economy is discussed in this place is to point at other places and seek excuses, despite the fact that very many of the levers that we have to impact the economy, whether it's the skills system, the planning system, transport and infrastructure, are held here. But let me say this, is that I think it has actually demonstrated the fact that this place hasn't lived up to the potential of this place, because economic growth has barely been mentioned. Because if we had economic growth, so many of the difficulties that we've been talking would be alleviated. The difficulties we have in terms of public expenditure, of the choices we have to make, would become significantly easier. But it is a fact that this government has let Scotland down. It has not lived up to the economic potential of this country. It is a fact that economic performance has lagged for the last decade, and that's not a point of conjecture. It's not a subjective opinion. We know that because of income tax devolution. Since 2016, our economic growth per head has been lower than that of income. We know the rest of the UK. We know that because of the way that the fiscal formula works. Jamie Green said it is complicated, that not many people understand how it works in detail. They don't need to. It is a simple point that it assigns income tax on the basis of wage growth. When wage growth is faster in Scotland, we get more money. If it is lower than the rest of the UK, we get less money to spend. And it is a fact, according to the Fiscal Commission, we have £1 billion less to spend because economic growth has been slower in Scotland since 2016 than the rest of the UK. That is the cost of economic failure under the SNP's administration over the last 10 years. It is not an opinion, it is a fact, and it is an inescapable one. But it's not just with regard to economic growth that the SNP have failed. It's within the administration of the tax system itself. Clearly, members are in denial of the opinions of the Fraser Islander Institute when it comes to the tax burden with regard to income tax. But it's not just about whether Scots on average pay more. It's also how the income tax system works in Scotland. Because it's a fact that we should be highlighting teachers, police and nurses, not just because of the excellent work they do, because of their dedication, because they pay a 50% rate of marginal tax. It is a fact that if you earn between £43,662 and £50,270, you will pay a higher rate of marginal tax than those people earning more than you. That is a disgrace. The fact that we think that teachers, police constables and nurses should be paid a higher marginal rate than people earning almost £100,000 is a scandal. It is a sign of economic and fiscal incompetence on behalf of the SNP. But it doesn't have to be like this, because there are other parts of the UK that have higher rates of growth than Scotland, with fewer economic powers. It is a fact that Greater Manchester has experienced higher rate of growth than Scotland by over 1% per year, and that their GDP per head is now higher than that of Scotland. A decade and a half ago, the GDP per head in Manchester was lower than that. That is a superior economic performance with fewer economic powers. That is the difference that actually focusing on the economy can make. So Scotland is being let down under the SNP. And we have a choice in May. We have a choice between a government that seeks to simply narrate problems and seek to point in the direction, or choose a party that actually seeks to confront problems, come up with solutions and make lives better for Scots. And that's the choice that Scotland will face in May. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. We now move to closing speeches. I call on Patrick Harvey to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Conservative Party are continually telling us that their focus in today's debate is to tackle the cost of living. And yet it's very clear that in rolling back, in reversing progressive changes to income tax, it is inevitable that the biggest benefit will go to those on the highest incomes. So they say they want to tackle the cost of living, but they'll give the biggest benefit. With 4 minutes, I don't have time for an intervention. They'll give the biggest benefit to those on the highest incomes. And they want to fund this by cutting social security. Social security addresses the cost of living for those who face the worst challenges. And let's remind ourselves, of course, that most people who need support from the social security system are working. They're in working households. I know that there are people on the right who like to pretend that there's some hard and fast division between those who contribute to the economy and those who take from it. But it's a spurious nonsense. Most people who need support from social security are working. And their plan would devastate the public services that help people cope with the cost of living. The truth is that even during this really difficult session of the Scottish Parliament and during this incredibly challenging period since Tory austerity came in, progress has been made on the effective ways of cutting the cost of living. Just in recent years, cutting public transport costs, for example. Greens have done that on bus, on trains, on ferries, and we could do so much more. We'll set out plans for expanding free bus travel to under 30s. Cutting rent. Extractive, exploitative rent levels are one of the biggest and most unnecessary costs that a great many people are landed on. But the Conservatives, they don't want to control rents, they want to let them continue to spiral. And as for giving households the benefit of cheap, clean energy, instead of leaving people dependent on high and volatile fossil fuel prices, the Conservatives want to rip up climate legislation and abandon the opportunities from cheap, clean energy. We can do so much more on all of these effective ways of tackling the cost of living, but all of it needs investment, and that's why all of it depends on a progressive tax system. Presiding Officer, I want to say something about the Labour amendment as well before I finish. And I know that Daniel Johnson and others want to focus on growth. He's aware that the Greens are the only party really who disagree with the fundamentals of that. We're the ones who are often alone in arguing that growth-focused policies often fail to achieve progressive distribution in their outcomes. That's why history shows that there can be periods of growth, even booming growth, while poverty still increases. But even setting aside that argument, the Labour Party's failure to support Scotland's move to more progressive taxation is striking. At first, they gradually accepted it. But without any enthusiasm. More recently, they have actively opposed changes toward making income tax more progressive. And just like the Conservatives, they often call...
the member's in his last minute.
I don't have time for an intervention. They often call for more public spending. At least the Greens, when we do that, we match our calls for spending and investment with serious, deliverable and workable proposals for the tax policies needed to raise the revenue to make those spending commitments possible. Mr Mara must surely be aware of the problems Labour has created for itself at UK level, ruling out changes to major taxes alongside the fiscal rules and self-imposed constraints has left the Chancellor with a choice of which promises to break. So the idea that without knowing future economic circumstances or UK tax changes, that the Scottish Government could rule out tax changes till 2031 is extraordinary. Presiding Officer, we need to maintain the commitment to progressive taxation if we want to see investment in public services and real support for people with the cost of living.
Thank you, Mr Harvey. I now call on Michael Mara to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Having listened to the speeches from the SNP bench this afternoon, I'm more convinced than ever they simply do not understand the mess they have made of Scotland's finances, let alone have a plan to fix it. They have wasted over £7 billion of taxpayers' money on ferries that don't sail, roads that don't get dualled and schools that don't get built. Their incompetent handling of our infrastructure resulted in £1.3 billion of additional costs and 67 years of delays to vital projects. They have targeted middle earners, our nurses, teachers and police officers with tax hikes to cover for their incompetence. And they have failed to be honest with the public about the complete and utter mess they've made of Scotland's public finances. And Jamie Hepburn in his contribution was rightly critical of the Liz Truss unfunded budget that crashed the economy. That was £45 billion of unfunded spending. I would wonder whether he would be critical at all of the £95 billion of spending demands that have come from his own front bench and the opposition to £45 billion of revenue raisers that have come from the SNP. That's £140 billion of a fiscal adjustment. That's the kind of incredible position that the SNP are taking on the public finances. In contrast, since the general election, Labour has delivered £10.3 billion of additional funding for Scotland. Lord only knows where we would be without it. Because what we're going to see next week is that any room for manoeuvre has been eliminated by the SNP's own incompetence. They're staring down, we're all staring down, a £1.6 billion, no thank you sir, £1.6 billion black hole going into that budget next week. And added to their wasteful, incompetent approach, their abject failure to grow Scotland's economy, as set out by Daniel Johnson, has cost the budget dearly. Real consequences in people's services. Over £1 billion in this financial year alone, owing to what the Scottish Fiscal Commission have termed the economic performance gap. Patrick Harvey is not alone, clearly, in his opposition to economic growth. It's shared by the government. That's what Scotland should have to spend if we had a government focused on growth, or at least one that understood how to grow the economy. After years of chaotic short-term budgets from the SNP, they simply cannot be trusted with the public money. For Scotland's sake, we should all hope this is the last budget that the SNP delivers. But now, after we had 3 consecutive years under this government of emergency cuts budgets because they could not balance the books, they say that next Tuesday's budget will have all the answers. But if they can't be trusted with your money, how can you trust a word they say on any of this? Why should we believe them? It will fall to the next Scottish Government to fix the mess that the SNP has made. Daniel Johnson, I think in this context, set out quite well the issue of people paying a higher marginal tax rate, earning just over £40,000, than people who are far richer than themselves. Members both in the Green and the SNP benches should question whether that is progressive at all, Mr Harvey, whether it's progressive at all. So it will fall to the next Scottish Government to fix the mess that the SNP has made, to spend taxpayers' money wisely and account for every penny, ensuring that that SNP culture of waste comes to an end once and for all, to rebuild the public finances and public services, our NHS, our schools and our local services. That is the choice Scotland can take in May with a Scottish Labour Government.
Thank you, Mr Mara. I now call on Minister Ivor McKee to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And at a time when public finances are under pressure, it's more important than ever that we engage in constructive, serious, evidence-based debate about our nation's priorities, and I'm not sure how much of that we saw this afternoon. This debate comes down to a clear choice, the responsible approach to tax and spending versus proposals that lack any semblance of clarity or credible path to funding. I mentioned in my opening remarks that there must be an expectation that any party proposing major tax cuts must be prepared to explain how they would fund them, and there was an absolute absence of that this afternoon. We will, they shout, but they haven't. We all remember the turmoil caused by the Liz Truss mini-budget. Jamie Hepburn reminded us of that this afternoon with its promises of tax cuts without a clear plan to pay for them. And I would ask anyone taking part in this debate to consider whether they've had a credible plan from the Conservative Party to fund a £1 billion reduction to the Scottish budget next year. And Patrick Harvey, amongst others, highlighted clear examples to the housing budget, to the Scottish Child Payment and others that wouldn't even cover that £1 billion cut. But I suppose an area of consensus is the recognition of the importance of doing what we can to support household finances at a time when budgets are tight and demands on services continue to grow. The importance of the cost of living situation was a point made correctly by Jamie Green. I think it was the only correct point he made. And I don't know if he's suggesting that if the Scottish Government cut taxes to the same level of the UK, that wouldn't cost us £1.7 billion. Of course it would. And also the fact that, yes, people are leaving Scotland, but more people are coming into Scotland from the rest of the UK than are leaving to go down south. Other points that have been made this afternoon, I want to just mention Megan Gallagher's points, and it's now clear, I think, some clarity on where the Tories would save this money. They're against free things. They're obviously against free tuition fees. They're against free prescriptions. They're against free bus travel. They're for 2 million Scots, or indeed against the free baby box. So get some clarity on that has been not unhelpful. And turning to the comments from Daniel Johnson, I just pulled up, he talks about facts, so I've pulled up in front of me the data that I've got in terms of economic growth rate, Scotland versus the UK, last available data, 3-month on 3-month growth rates, percentages. October 2025, Scotland 0.2%, UK minus 0.1%. Maybe that was a one-off. Look at September last year, Scotland 0.2%, UK 0.1%, double the rate in Scotland. Let's look at the month before that, August 2025. Scotland 0.5%, more than double the UK rate of 0.2%. July 2025, Scotland 0.5%, more than double the UK rate of 0.2%. And it's a country that's got unemployment consistently significantly lower than across the rest of the UK. Indeed.
Briefly, Mr Johnson.
You've got some numbers.
The Minister asked me if I got some numbers. Has he consulted the Fiscal Commission? And what is the facts that he's relating to there with regard to 2016, which is the year that the income tax devolution is baselined against?
Minister.
I'm talking about 2025, not 2016, and I've given him the numbers, and if he's going to come to the debate, he should be bringing the numbers to have a proper debate about this. Ultimately, Presiding Officer, governing is about making real decisions, not gestures. It's about balancing the need to raise revenues and fund essential services with the impact that has on taxpayers and households. And we've been always clear on the need for cross-party engagement on tax and spending. Credible and realistic alternatives are always welcome when put forward with honesty and transparency. And I hope some of the discussions we've had across the chamber on this year's budget will see some of that, but it's sad to say we haven't seen much of it this afternoon. To close, I would ask Parliament to recognise the importance of credibility in the tax proposals brought forward by any other party in this chamber and support the Government amendment ahead of our tax and spending plans being set out next week on the 13th of January. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. And I call on Liz Smith to wind up the debate on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please.
I think that this debate has not only shown why the tax issue is so critical to the forthcoming Scottish budget, and can I commend both Daniel Johnson and Jamie Green for their speeches in that particular regard, because it does matter. But it's also, this debate, shown up what the clear blue water is between the different political parties. And that's as it should be, because aside from all the general agreement that we have about Adam Smith's principles of taxation, there's a much wider debate to be had about what we expect the tax system to do for our country. And that debate could hardly be more important given the fiscal situation in which we find ourselves. And to Mr Hepburn, it would be very helpful if we could all acknowledge the true facts about the extent of the tax burden. Now, the SNP gives us three defence lines when it comes to its tax policy. Firstly, it tells us it's progressive. Well, that's no different, I have to tell Ivan McKee, from many other tax systems around the world. But secondly, that in return for paying higher taxes in Scotland, the SNP say that we get far more benefits like Scottish Child Payment, free university tuition and free prescriptions. The trouble is that the total funding of these so-called free benefits, which of course are not free at all, is, as the Scottish Fiscal Commission has pointed out time after time, completely unsustainable for Scottish taxpayers, not just now, but over the long term too. And worse still, the Scottish public sees no improvement in public services. And his third plea, which we heard again from the First Minister just on Monday, is that Scotland would be far better if it was independent. Now, that is just plain nonsense, as every credible economic analyst tells us. If Brexit was so bad for the Scottish economy, as the SNP keeps telling us, they should recall their individual and independent adviser, Mark Blythe, who was telling them that independence would be Brexit times 10. That sums up neatly just what the economic situation would be with independence. Now, the huge problem that the SNP has is that its long-term adherence to its current tax policy has not yielded the results that Scotland needs, or indeed that the SNP predicted. Higher tax rates have deterred economic growth, they've acted as a disincentive to middle and higher earners, and our revenue has been less than it should have been had we had better earnings and employment growth, as had happened in the rest of the UK. Now, it's 2 decades ago since John Swinney was... Yes, of course I will.
Minister?
I just took the time to read out the last, well, not 2, not 3, not 4 months actually of data, and I could have gone on showing that Scotland had higher economic growth than the rest of the UK. Has Liz Smith not looked at that data?
Liz Smith very much looked at that data, but she's looked at it in the round, and she's seen a whole lot of other economic statistics that are not really something that Mr McKee would like to talk about. Now, it is 2 decades ago since John Swinney was Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth, as I think it was called in those days, when he made several speeches about his concern over the weak pattern of growth in the Scottish economy. And he also flagged up to me in the Finance Committee in February 2023 that he thought economic inactivity was the biggest challenge facing the Scottish economy. He told us that he wanted the focus to be on entrepreneurship, supporting business, and on the SNP's ambition to deliver a smaller and more effective government for Scotland. Well, that was then, and this is now. With regard to supporting businesses over the last 2 decades, it has been a dismal picture for the Scottish Government, because they have witnessed progressively higher tax burden being imposed on hard-working Scots over many years without the requisite improvement in public services or widening the tax base. And unbelievably, 3 budgets ago, they saw an 8.3 real terms cut in the economy portfolio and real terms cuts in the enterprise, trade and investment budgets. And they failed to pass on business rates in full. Last year, the Deputy First Minister said that we shouldn't over-worry, as inward investment was strong and that Scottish enterprise was working very hard to stimulate growth in the business sector. But she also applied in that same speech that the difficult choices of government had had less success when it came to the skills agenda. And I agree with her about that. There is an issue writ large in the minds of our colleges and universities who have for years been grappling with pernicious underfunding and financial models that are simply not fit for purpose. And with regard to John Swinney's promise in 2007 to ensure that Scotland had a smaller and more effective government, well, the facts speak for themselves. The tentacles of the state within Scotland, particularly with regard to social policy, have only ever been increasing. And of course, the size of the state has burgeoned through the growth of quangos, a leviathan, an unreformed public sector, and of course we all know what's happened to the number of civil servants. But of course, this budget, just like its immediate predecessors, seems set to be stubbornly fixed on the so-called social contract, which cannot be paid for, and which, as every economic forecaster tells us, is the main reason for a deeper and deeper fiscal hole because of the exponential rise in the benefits bill. Ministers know from the Scottish Fiscal Commission, the Auditor-General, the Fraser-Allander Institution, and I could remember several other ones, there is a concern about a lack of consistency within the Scottish Government over fiscal strategy and how to make their spending commitments. This Government, Presiding Officer, lacks fiscal credibility, its tax policies are punitive and disincentivising, and there is no coherent strategy across the Government. It lacks the necessary policies to create the growth that we should desperately see, and what John Swinney in 2007 said was his overriding objective.
Thank you, Ms Smith. That concludes the debate on lowering bills for Scotland's workers. There will be a very short pause before we move on to the next item of business.